Awesome. Justin Douglas is Managing Director at Just in Canada, an independent alternative media platform and YouTube channel that gives voice to innovators, community activists, educators, and other involved, informed Canadians. Recently, Justin released a documentary called Fairy Creek, The Last Stand, and that's what we're going to chat about today. Thank you so much, Justin, for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Janine. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you, and you too. So I always like to start with knowing people's vegan story. How did you find that path?
Well, I grew up in a very alternative family. My mother, way back in the day, in the early 80s, I was brought up on carob powder and soy milk and alternative things from a very young age. But then as I grew up, I had to find that own process and journey for myself. So I've always been at least pescatarian. Never really, eating meat just wasn't something that resonated with me. But as I've grown, I also realized that I had celiacs and an intolerance to dairy products. And so I really had to educate myself on nutrition and what works for my diet. And then just my love for animals just sort of helped me on my own journey towards a plant-based diet.
Right, that definitely keeps one on the path, I think, once we realize that we're really in it for the animals. I think that's a very strong commitment. Yeah, okay, and then has that, sorry?
No, I was just going to say also just the karmic connection, like I do believe that when we eat other beings, other life forms, that energy comes with us, and having animals in the agro business that are so traumatized, having that energy within us just creates a certain sort of karmic energy, and I really want to not have that karma within my own being, and really work towards healing all beings on this planet.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And somebody said to me too that, when you feel fear, there's hormones are released, right? And when you feel anger or all of these emotions, and certainly animals going to their death are going to have those feelings. So I appreciate the karmic energy level, but even on a biological level, I think that people are actually ingesting those hormones, right?
Absolutely.
And then when we talk about the forest, it occurs to me that much of the Amazon has been clear cut for growing food for animals primarily. And I wonder when I see them doing things like destroying ancient forests here, is that what's going on and real estate? Have you pondered that?
Yeah, I mean, it's all based on resource extraction for high profit values. In Canada, we have the boreal rainforest, which is a system that runs across Canada, sequesters the same amount of carbon as the Amazon does. So we actually in Canada are Amazon North, and a lot of people don't realize that our rainforest is just as valuable and just as much in need of protection as the Amazon is, and both are vital in our ability to function as a planet in terms of carbon sequestering, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate change, water, fire, all of these things, they're all very dependent on these forests. And so I think we in British Columbia especially have a very strong resource industry. A lot of, since the time of colonization in British Columbia, a lot of the work, a lot of the business that has come out of this province is resource extraction. So trees, forestry, mining, and all of these other sort of industries, oil, that have led to high profits, but haven't necessarily been to the best interest of us for the long term. And so we can dive more into that.
Yeah, for sure. And also, it occurs to me that there's all these creatures in the rainforest. I mean, the rainforest, I don't even think we've sort of cataloged all the minuscule little bugs and creatures and lichens and ferns and stuff, right? So it's, we think about the bears and the other animals, the large animals, the human and the climate, but there's also this whole other, it's an ecosystem, right? It's a really diverse ecosystem.
Yeah, there's so much biodiversity that we are absolutely have no idea what's in there, and it needs to be protected. Like in British Columbia, we're down to the last, I think, 2.7% of old growth forest, untouched old growth. And these systems, you can't take biodiverse systems and plant them into a second growth forest. It just doesn't work. And so these areas need to be protected. And that's sort of why I think there's so much civic engagement now into these issues, because, it's been going on for a long time in British Columbia. There was the Walrand Valley, Carmana Valley, all of these things that happened in the 90s where people thought, okay, well, now we're going to see some real protected areas. And there were little chunks that have been protected, but we're down to these last remaining bits. Like Fairy Creek is the last untouched watershed on southern Vancouver Island. And once it's gone, there's no bringing it back. These are 2,000, sometimes 2,000-year-old cedars, ancient trees that once they're gone, there is no way to bring them back in our lifetime or anyone else's lifetime.
I remember the first time I went into the Walrand, and just, it's overwhelming, isn't it? The feeling of being in those places. And I've heard them described as like cathedrals. They really are. Like the energy in those places is really, it's hard to explain.
It's magic. If anyone ever has the opportunity to go into these areas, I would highly, highly recommend it, whether it's one of the protected provincial parks or some of the still untouched old growth areas, that it is an experience. And Bill Jones, who's one of the elders, a Pachidat elder, who is one of the symbolic, leaders of the Save the Fairy Creek movement, we were lucky enough to interview him for our documentary. And he shared that in his tradition, it's almost like you can see the past, the present, and the future, and you never know who you're going to meet in these forests. And that's something that really resonated with me, because there's something very magic and spiritual about it. Regardless of your beliefs, there is an energy, and these are some of the oldest living beings on the planet. And there's no way to not have some sort of energetic connection with these amazing, amazing beings.
Yeah, and let's talk about the First Nations Indigenous people, and Bill Jones is one of the spokespeople. If you look at the kind of corporate media that has very minimally covered the situation, that has been going on for a long time now. So perhaps you could give us a bit of a background of, what has happened from the beginning of the Forest Defender Camp and the Indigenous. They kind of presented on the corporate media as like this divide, that there's some that are wanting to log it and they want these people to go away. And then there's this movement of forest defenders, sort of, as you say, led by Bill Jones. Can you explain what was it?
Yeah. It's a very complicated ongoing issue, and there's lots of people who can probably speak to it more in depth than I can. But just from doing the documentary and speaking with people on the ground, Fairy Creek is a watershed on southern Vancouver Island between Port Renfrew, closer to Port Renfrew, and Cowichan Lake. There are a number of Indigenous nations whose unceded traditional territory it encompasses, mainly the Pachidat Nation. It does go into a little bit of the Dididat. The territories overlap a little bit, but then there's the Dididat, and that's closer to Nitnat Lake, and the Coast Valley, which is also being logged. It's a separate logging cut block, but Fairy Creek is sort of synonymously become to encompass all of these areas. And then there's the Paiute Nation as well, and those three signatures, all three nations signed this 2-year declaration with the NDP government, which we can go back to in a second. So there's three nations. The predominant nation of Fairy Creek, of that area, is the Pachidat Nation. Bill Jones is one of the elders, and it's his traditional hunting and fishing territory that the protesters have occupied as their headquarters space. There is a band council as well as hereditary chiefs, and there's a long history of the difference between the band council and a hereditary chief. A lot of it has to do with the Indian Act and then treaties. And so in Canadian historical relationships, there were treaties between the Queen or the Crown and Indigenous nations. And that was the assumption that there are two equal parties, that when you have a treaty, you're entering with equal sovereigns in this situation. But then you have the Indian Act that comes in and basically says Indigenous people are subjects of the Canadian state. And so through the Indian Act, they imposed a band council, which effectively removed hereditary chiefs or the the traditional lineage of most Indigenous cultures and imposed an electoral system, which wasn't necessarily part of those traditions. It wasn't part of those traditions. It was a very colonial imposition. The federal government will only, and provincial government, the Canadian governments will only interact with band councils because they are, through the Indian Act, what they perceive as the appropriate mechanism for interaction. So John Horgan called an election about a year ago. Let's actually back up. So the Fairy Creek, it started about a year ago when Teal Jones, a logging company, it's the largest logging company in British Columbia, privately owned logging company. There's others, there's Western Forest Products there in the Kaikous Valley. But for Fairy Creek specifically, it's TFL 46, Tree License 46. It's an agreement between the province of British Columbia and Teal Jones to go in and log this area. So about a year ago, a number of protesters, I think it started with some teenagers and some hikers, went into this area, realized that it was up for logging, and decided that, hey, this is not what should be happening. This is really in danger of destroying this ecosystem. We need to do something about it. And slowly the movement built up and built up and built up into Save the Fairy Creek movement, and then into the Rainforest Flying Squad, which is an evolution of that movement. And so it's a very loose-knit organization. There's not necessarily identified leaders, although there's a bunch of different spokespeople within the movement. And so it's very complicated because you have the forestry industry, you have government, you have different Indigenous nations, you have people who are very much in favor of protecting these old growth forests, and you have very entrenched interests who make a lot of money on destroying these forests. And so about 3 months ago, there was an injunction. So Teal Jones went to the court and said, we want these protesters removed from this area. We want to be able to go in and log. The injunction, the justice allowed a 6-month injunction, which gave RCMP the ability to go in and start to remove protesters. So this is when things really started to heat up. And since that time, over the last 3 months, RCMP have arrested over 800 protesters. There is some pretty disturbing video that's now come out of RCMP using violence, pepper spray, targeting Indigenous, Black Indigenous people of color, people from the queer community being targeted for violence, for really inappropriate action. And then there's a lot of information that's coming out of mainstream media that counters some of the realities that are happening on the ground. And so it's hard to get accurate information. And that's why my husband and I felt it was important to go in and document and speak with some of the people on the ground, as well as some of the politicians, to try to understand for ourselves what's really happening.
Right. There's a lot there. Okay, first of all, let's unpack some of that. So the idea of unseated, we hear that word a lot. What's your understanding of what that means?
Yeah, going back again to treaty relationships. So some nations have a treaty relationship where they have agreements with the government. Any nation that is through the Indian Act means that there's no treaty. There's no treaty for that nation. So they never actually agreed to any sort of agreement, any sort of relationship with the Crown. The Crown, basically the government of Canada through the British Crown, has come in and said, you are subjugated. You are a subject of Canadian territory, and this is what's going to happen. And then that's when reserves were carved out and these different things. So these Indigenous groups never agreed to giving up their territory to the Canadian government or to the Crown. So that's when it's unceded. It means there was never a relationship of consent.
Right. So the lands were just kind of taken.
They were taken. Yeah. They were taken with no consultation, in the same way that Indigenous children were taken from homes by the RCMP and put into residential schools.
Right. And the Band Council, the created sort of established government system that the federal government, the Canadian government said, okay, you can organize, but this is the way you have to organize. It was very colonialist imposition. And would you agree it was another way to try to assimilate the First Nation?
Yeah. It's cultural genocide. I mean, at this point, I think we've come to realize that we as white settler Canadians have had this disbelief that the government or the RCMP or we as a society would actually be involved in the subjugation and really the erasure of Indigenous culture. But now with the children who have been found in so many residential schools across this country, with the 60s scoop, with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, there is no ability to deny that Canada has been complicit in at least cultural genocide, if not full-on genocide of Indigenous peoples.
Would you also agree that destroying these forests, which contain the medicines and the cedar trees, and where the Indigenous people lived, is also a form of genocide, right?
It's ecocide. It is absolute ecocide. Yeah, there's no other term for it. There is the ability for the resource industry to have second growth harvests. There is the ability to have value added wood. There is the ability to think about ecotourism, job retraining. There's lots of different things that we could be doing to ensure jobs for the people in that industry, as well as the greater community. That's not happening. It is purely about extracting as much of the resources as possible for the highest level of profits for a very small portion of our society, which is industry. And it's the people at the top. It's not the loggers who are making a lot of money. These jobs are temporary. If we were really concerned about logger jobs, as so much of the mainstream media suggests, there would be an increase in jobs. But what we've seen on Vancouver Island, and Sonia Personal was very helpful, the leader of the BC Green Party, in helping me understand this, is that over the last while in British Columbia, we've seen the level of trees being logged go up, but the number of jobs decrease. And this is because forestry is becoming more mechanized. There are faster ways to take down these trees with less people involved in the process. And Teal Jones, for example, in 2019, when we hit a little bit of a slump in the forestry, they fired 800 forestry workers because they said that it was no longer viable to keep them employed without offering them any sort of job alternatives. But at the same time, moved to Virginia in the United States, bought 2 plants and started logging operations there for millions and millions of dollars, effectively taking all of the money that they had made in British Columbia from these 800 employees, firing them, and then taking those resources to the United States, while saying at the same time, sorry, we have nothing for you. So it's not about jobs, it's about profit.
Right. Just also mention that the culturally modified trees, I remember the first time I saw those was during the tree sit at Cathedral Grove back a little while ago, where they were going to try to take some more of Cathedral Grove. And Ingmar Lee at that time was involved with putting up the platforms and such things. And we went on a hike, and he explained to me about the culturally modified cedar trees, where the Indigenous people would take a strip of the cedar up the tree, and then use that, dry it, and use it for weaving baskets and hats and such things. But the tree remains. And it occurred to me at that time, if you're wiping out a whole forest and you're just destroying this, you're destroying the history. Because I think when they end up sometimes going to court, like up in Wet'suwet'en, and trying to prove, no, this is our land, we did used to live here, and they have to actually go to court to try to prove that, which seems absurd to me. But if there's no evidence, like at least if they could point to these culturally modified trees, right? But by removing them, they're removing any evidence that these people were even here. It's really horrifying.
Yeah, grandmother Rose Henry, she's also goes by grandmother Losa, is a Tla'amin elder, Tla'amin, T-L-A'-A-M-I-N, Tla'amin, elder, who's been very involved in this protest movement and civil disobedience in many of the movements in southern Vancouver Island. And she also participated in the interview or in the documentary, and she very clearly articulated that Indigenous people have never taken more than they need, that they would take these trees to build a canoe or to use for basket weaving or for other cultural purposes, but they would never destroy an ecosystem. They would work with it in balance to make sure that it was preserved. And they did that for time immemorial. We, as settlers, have destroyed 97% of this ecosystem in 150 years. I mean, we are a toxic species in this province, and we need to realize that really quickly and change our behavior, because the alternative is self-destruction. And it's not, with climate crisis with these forest fires. It's like, what is it going to take for us as a culture, as a species, as humanity, to realize that we are out of balance, that a capitalist, neoliberal, individualistic, me first, who cares about anyone else, society does not work. And having a very small percentage of our population control so many resources while the rest of us are left out in the dust is not a way for us to function as a society. And we need to have a reckoning of that really quickly, because it's going to get a lot worse if we don't.
Yeah, no kidding. And the idea of thinking about what we're doing for 7 generations, I think that's kind of a common thread in the first peoples across the world. Even this idea that as long as I'm okay, and then who cares about the rest of it it's such its time has long passed, and they need to move on. I was happy to hear someone in your documentary, which is a really great documentary. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Speaking about Wildwood, I remember Merv Wilkinson hearing him speak, years ago. He is this elder man who established this forest doing alternative, plucking trees out of the forest without the clear cutting, and then realizing, when you go through some of the remaining forests here and you see these stumps that have notches in them, that's when they used to actually take a single tree out, and it was hugely labor intensive, right? And have you been to Wildwood? Or
I don't. I only am familiar with it through Kathy Code. She's one of the spokespeople for the Flying Rainforest movement, and she's also on the board of the Eco Wildwood Forest, which is when I first learned about it. But it shows that there are examples with that forest, with the Great Bear Rainforest. There are ways to protect these forests and still make them viable for selective logging, for ecotourism, and for a whole host of other activities that can be done on the land to make it both profitable, environmentally friendly, and a place where everyone can enjoy the land, including the animals who live there.
Right. Yeah, clear cutting. I mean, if people haven't seen a clear cut, it's like death. It's like going into a dead zone. There's nothing going on there.
It's horrifying, and it's everywhere on Vancouver Island. And if you take a helicopter, and many people have, even across British Columbia, you can see these massive areas. Even driving from Lake Cowichan to Port Renfrew on the back highway, you go through this road where you have these different mountains, and there's just chunks and chunks of these missing forests where it's just clear cut now. And industry has said, well, we do replanting, we do all of these different things, but they don't, because if they did, it wouldn't look like this. And these pictures are not put out in mainstream media. And even the big forest fire we just had on Vancouver Island in Ladysmith was started in a clear cut area, and mainstream media has not discussed that at all. That they say, well, this forest is burning. Well, yes, but it started in a massive clear cut area and moved everywhere else. And so clear cuts put us all in danger. And there are a lot of clear cuts across this province.
And displacing animals too, and because they tend to travel, right? They roam around, and if they can't get from one area to another, it's very destructive. Yeah, the dominant mainstream media, I guess they're just beholden to their advertisers, right? And their advertisers are corporations, and that's why we get the messages that we get from them.
Yeah, in Canada and most corporate news countries, our news is owned by very few sources. And so we think there's all these different media outlets, there's all these tools for information. But that's not actually the case. It's mainly 6 corporations who own the majority of the media in Canada. And some of them actually go to American hedge funds. And so you can sort of funnel up, there's the Bell, Global, CBC, and CBC is still somewhat publicly funding, but it has its own particular agenda of national unity and with price cutting and all these different things, it has its own issues. But corporate media is beholden to its shareholders, not to the public interest. And alternative media, things like what I'm trying to do, what you're trying to do, it's very difficult for grassroots journalists to find funding in order to counter these mainstream narratives. Because if you're a giant corporation, you have a lot of money, to invest into stories that tell a particular narrative. And those narratives, I mean, when Suncor, for example, owns all of our newspapers, and they are very conservative, and they want, the conservatives to be reelected, and so they'll put advertisements out knocking the liberals, and then you have the liberals with the Globe and Mail doing the same thing towards the conservatives, and there's no separation. Like, the media is supposed to be the fourth wall between this government, and that's not the case in Canada any longer, or really in any democracies. The media are often spokespeople for particular interests, and these interests have a voice in mainstream media, in government, in industry, but it's not the public interest. And I think more people are starting to wake up to that realization, but not enough people and not quickly enough.
Kind of more like propaganda, it seems to me.
Yeah, it is. But then there's also the danger too of these right-wing Facebook groups and different, propaganda sites that have come up also, and people turn to YouTube to get information, which rightly so, because there's so much mistrust in mainstream media and government narratives. But where do we get accurate information? And so I've said this before, there's science and there's fact, and these things are also important, and there's also your intuition and feeling what feels right. And when you have certain right-wing people spouting a particular viewpoint that feels like hatred or racism or these different things, that probably doesn't feel like the truth. That probably feels like a tool to create fear and anger and mistrust. And, when you're looking towards finding true information, true news, it has to be towards the side of love and light. Even though there's all these horrible things that are happening on our planet, there still has to be a certain level of accountability in what we consume and where we consume it from, and holding these people accountable to what we're being told.
Okay, yeah, but ultimately, I think people need to support independent media. We need to find sources that we trust and support them. But I think we're smart enough. Hopefully, we're educated enough that we can then discern. We can watch different sources and then make up our own mind, rather than we've kind of got to a point where people just believe everything coming from the mainstream media, rather than going, okay, well, that's interesting, but I'm just going to check what the other side is saying, and then kind of come up with what you believe. Because even science can be manipulated. I mean, let's face it.
Everything can.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
When I was in school, we would have to, I have a degree in political science from the University of Victoria, and then I went to McGill and I double majored in common law and civil law. And we would always be presented with these sort of scientific factual pieces, but then you would find out it's being funded by a particular corporation. So you can always find a paper that goes for this side, for that side, for something in between. So there is a certain level of discernment, absolutely. But I think also with like the Noam Chomsky style of helping people realize that there is a high level of manipulation that comes out of mainstream media, and we're all susceptible to it. We all are. It's about creating fear and anxiety and keeping our vibration as low as possible so that we don't challenge the power structures that we don't raise ourselves up. And that's the real challenge, is still being informed without always living in a place of fear.
Right, because the fear is used to divide us as well. That's for sure. Well, let's talk about the media response in the forest. Like, how were you received by the camp, and then how were you treated by the authorities at Fairy Creek?
It took a while. I mean, David and I are two white dudes who just rocked up and we're like, hey, we want to do a documentary. And they're like, who are you? Where are you coming from? Why should I talk to you? So it took a number of visits to build trust with people and explain what we were doing and where we were coming from. We self-funded the documentary. We released it on YouTube. We weren't trying to ask for any money. We're not trying to make a profit out of it. We just felt very passionate that there needed to be a counter to some of these mainstream narratives that were going on. We wanted to go for ourselves and see what was really happening on the ground. And so we spent a number of days, weekends, weeks going up there. We were lucky enough to have a RCMP media relations officer willing to speak with us. That hasn't always been the case. So we do have one officer who spoke with us on camera, and I'm very grateful for that. She was very good at articulating a particular line. And so she's very trained in that. So I appreciate her speaking with us. Some of the things that she said didn't line up with the realities that were happening on the ground. But because of our relationship with her, we were allowed to pass some of the roadblocks and go up to these exclusion zones. But as you see in the documentary, even once we're past, let's say, roadblock 1, there's another roadblock, then there's an exclusion zone, we still weren't allowed to actually see what was going on, what the police were doing. And so often when we were working with the media liaison, we were kept out from actually seeing what was going on, and it felt like we were there for symbolic purposes, that we weren't actually being given real access to what was taking place. And other media people, like, we haven't been there as long as other independent media on the ground, and there's been some really incredible work done by other journalists, other independent journalists, and they have been threatened with arrests. They have been arrested. Colin Smith, who works for Buzz Victoria, I think his last name is Smith, he was video documenting some things that were going on. The RCMP pulled him out. He was arrested. There was, I think it's called Black Press Media, a person of color, one of the only male Black reporters on the ground, has been consistently targeted for his reporting. There's another guy, I think, on Instagram who goes by Arvin Outside. He provided us some of the photos for our documentary. He's another person of color, has been highly targeted by our CMP for his media coverage. And Jennifer Osborne has been there on the ground. She's been doing redact photos. She's had a difficult time getting in. So there's been a lot of examples of media being held back. There was a court case that recently took place. The Canadian Association of Journalists, as well as a number of independent media outlets, including The Discourse, Indigenous News, Ricochet Media, all these independent media outlets in Canada, took the RCMP to court to basically say that having media be held back behind these exclusion lines is not in line with media freedom in Canada. It was held, the hearing was held in Nanaimo. Justice Thompson agreed with the media that it is an unlawful exclusion, that there is a right to access of media. But despite this, the RCMP is still keeping media out, as well as protesters, not letting them pass the lines, not being able to tell the true stories of what's going on. And so the RCMP are actually now ignoring court orders so their power comes through the court, and they are now ignoring that.
Oh, you guys need a lawyer for sure.
There's a lot of lawyers involved, and it's actually really sad how much money is being spent. And maybe I'll just hit on some of the money aspects around it. So Kathy Code, again, one of the many spokespeople for the Rainforest Flying Squad, said that through the injunction, Teal Jones has identified that in this particular small cut block, they're trying to access about $9 million worth of old growth profits. Of that 9 million, about 2 million goes to the province of British Columbia through stumpage fees, and about under 300,000 to the Pacheedaht Nation. So the Pacheedaht Nation is making a tiny fraction of this $9 million cut block. The province, 2 million. If you factor in now the fact that the RCMP have arrested over 800 people, the cost of enforcement of these police officers, helicopters, hotels, overtime, all of these different things, then the cost of the litigation, it is well over $2 million that we as taxpayers have spent on the enforcement of this injunction. And the RCMP are in effect acting as a private militia for industry. They are arresting public civil disobedience average citizens for their constitutional rights to protest. And the only people that benefit from this are industry. It's not, again, the forest workers. They are not going to benefit in the long run, because as soon as all of these old growth forests are done, you'll see that capital flees, and they're going to be left without job training, without skills. They'll have a short-term benefit, but then their livelihoods are going to be exactly the same, of being unemployed, the same way that when Teal Jones fired these 800 people. The taxpayer is on the hook for millions and millions and millions of dollars that could be invested into protection, reforestry, retraining, all of these other things. And all of this could be avoided if the NDP government under John Horgan would just issue a minister's directive. So the NDP government Again, there was an election. There was a minority government in British Columbia led by John Horgan. The balance of power was with the Green Party, Sonia Furstenau and Adam Olsen. And then at the time, I think Jeremy Weber was the leader. He resigned as the leader of the Green Party. Sonia Furstenau was elected as the new leader. She was elected for about a week before John Horgan called an election during the pandemic in order to get a majority government. He was polling higher. The Liberals were not doing as well. And so he effectively said, if you vote for me, I promise we will protect these old growth forests. And there was a review. They had a forestry plan. It's 14 recommendations. It's, I think, called the, the forestry panel review something. And we talk about it in the documentary, but there's basically 14 recommendations. And John Horgan committed to implementing all 14 recommendations. Since being elected, he has ignored that. He has not lived up to his promise. He's effectively said, no, you have to go to the courts. You have to go to the RCMP. The government has no responsibility in what's happening. But all of this could be easily avoided if we had leadership who was actually taking responsibility for what was happening on the ground. But instead, during the forest fires, during these mass protests, John Horgan decided to take a 2-week vacation and leave the province of British Columbia with absolutely no accountability. And so people say, well, Bryan Adams, very famous Canadian singer, went on CBC radio and said, well, in 4 years, we should vote this guy out. Well, voting for a dictator every 4 years is not democracy. That is not accountability. Giving someone a carte blanche for 4 years to destroy our province, and this has been going on election after election after election, that this first past the post, winner takes all system is not beneficial to everyday Canadians. That we do not have accountability in this top-down structure in our government. And it's happening over and over again. And it's happening now with Justin Trudeau calling an election again, trying to get a majority government because he thinks he can get, O'Toole out of there. Governments trying to grab power during a pandemic, 2 years into a mandate when it's unnecessary, is undemocratic. It's horrible for our people. And it just shows the zero accountability that we have in government right now. And one government after another says, here are the promises. We promised this, this, and this. Justin Trudeau, electoral reform, clean water for Indigenous people. 4 years later, 2 years later, when he calls another election, none of these things have happened. But if you vote for me again this time it's going to happen. I promise you, this time is the time. You've had time to do this. You haven't done it. None of you have. None of you are effective. You all need to go. It's time for something new.
Yeah, and that's the pattern, see, one of the advantages of living a long time on the planet. I think when we're young and we're like, yeah, we're going to change this and we're going to revolutionize it. And then you just see this pattern and it doesn't matter who gets elected. It's the same, the corporate rule. And some are calling it late stage capitalism at this point, the decline of the empire, and they're just clinging as hard as they can. But meanwhile, we're running out of time. Like, do we even have another 4 years? Is the thing with the climate and everything. I thought it was really interesting what Bill Jones said about John Horgan being buddies with one of the CEOs or whatever of Teal Jones. Were you able to confirm that?
No, there's a lot of speculation. I'm not an investigative journalist. I would love to have money to be able to do that kind of stuff. So no, we just had to go on his word there. There are a lot of rumors on the ground that there are pre-existing relationships. There are a lot of rumors on the ground of relationships because John Horgan used to be involved in the casinos, and that's part of how he got to power in British Columbia. There are a lot of allegations of mafia correlations between the casino and the government. There are a lot of allegations of behind the scenes deals going on. But no, I don't have any proof of these things, although I would not be surprised by it. I would actually almost be shocked if they weren't happening.
Should be good to have some investigative journalists somewhere in the media, right? And certainly what we have seen a pattern of is government elected officials. Once they leave those positions, they're not there forever. But they need a job afterwards. You know, you don't see them down at the food bank or work in this, you know, as a social worker trying to help people on the streets. They get a nice corporate job typically, and so part of it, I think somebody in your documentary sort of suggested that he's applying for a job, and he's proving that he can, by saying no to the people in the forest, that he's eligible for that kind of job. Yeah, the whole system is, it's no surprise that we're in the state we are as a species, I think, on this planet, given these corrupt systems. You know, and the injunction, the whole injunction process, I mean, we've seen that over and over as well. They did that at Clayoquot, where, so do you want to explain how the injunction process works?
Yeah. So basically, the Teal Jones or industry has a contract with government to be able to go in and clear cut these certain areas. And so for Teal Jones, as I mentioned, it's Tree Forest license number 46. The protesters were occupying the ground, preventing the industry from going in. So either by blocking roads or machinery or attaching themselves to tying themselves to trees through tripods, through different things. So industry then goes to court to ask for an injunction. The injunction effectively allows the RCMP to move in and to start to remove these protesters so that industry can go back to what they were doing before. This particular injunction is for 6 months. It was Justice Van Hoven, something like that, I believe. So he was the justice involved. It's also interesting to note that this justice used to work for a law firm that specialized in helping industry meet its goals, specifically the forestry and the mining industries. And so industry goes to the courts. The court grants the power for the RCMP to act on behalf of industry to remove all the protesters so they can go back to what they were doing, which is making money. This particular injunction was for a 6-month period, was granted in April, will be expiring or renewed or extended in September. So what happens, so part of the argument of why the RCMP are coming down so heavy right now is because they thought they were going to be in and out in 2 weeks. They were going to get rid of these protesters, get industry back to what they were doing. It's going to be over. But now it's been almost 6 months and the injunction is coming to an end. Once this injunction is over, they have no legal authority to be there. So they have to get rid of these protesters as quickly as possible, but it's not working. The protesters are coming back in. I don't even like calling them protesters because you're not just, it creates a negative connotation. They're really forest defenders, land defenders, Indigenous people, people of color, queer people, people from all facets of our society. It's not a bunch of hippies, although I'm sure there are some people who identify as hippie who are there. It is a full gamut of society who are there, people in suits, people who have law backgrounds, people who are from the business community. It is a full gamut of society who are there trying to protect the trees because a lot of British Columbians love our natural environment and we want to protect it. So anyway, there's this injunction. It's coming to an end in 6 months. The RCMP are being very heavy-handed in trying to get everybody out before this injunction is up. Every day that they're there, it is a massive cost to the taxpayer. And there have been freedom of information requests filed to find out exactly how much is being spent on a daily basis. That information hasn't come to light yet. But we know with Wet'suwet'en, there was over $13 million spent on RCMP enforcement. Whereas we as a province or as the federal government, as taxpayers, would not recoup anywhere near that amount of money on the oil or forestry that's being extracted. It all goes to private industry. It really doesn't go to the coffers of the public. So the fact that we are paying to arrest ourselves to help these very limited number of industry people make a lot more money shows how out of balance we are, that our money should not be going to helping industry reach their goals. It is not the public interest that's being defended here. And I'll just say too, there is a strong lack of voices from the Indigenous community who are being given a proper outlet on mainstream television. There are a number of land defenders who are Indigenous, of the Pacheedaht Nations, of the Diddidaht Nations, who would like to speak out but are not being given an opportunity to do so. And it's deplorable that the RCMP have been very heavy-handed, specifically with Indigenous people. And there are a number of examples. A woman who goes by Lady Chainsaw is one person in the documentary who we mentioned. She's in a wheelchair now. She's been arrested over 46 times, 48, 50 times at this point. Whaletail is an indigenous matriarch, from the Pacheedaht Nation. She's been arrested numerous times. They've asked for the ability to speak. They are not being given their voices, and they have been injured by the RCMP. And the RCMP says, well, it was in self-defense. You going and attacking Indigenous women, there's no self-defense that comes out of that. Indigenous women are not a threat to your physical well-being. You attacking them is where the violence is coming from. And there are a number of videos showcasing this. And yet the RCMP continues to deny that there's any sort of negligence on their part, where clearly there has been.
Well, they're protected, I guess, by the media that doesn't report on it, and by the industry that they're defending, and by the government that turns a blind eye. It's very, we should all be just ashamed of what is happening on our lands. And the whole injunction process too, when they arrest these protesters, as I recall, then they're taking it, if they get a chance to go to court, they're not able to speak to why they're doing this in the first place. It's simply, you were told not to be there and you were there, therefore it's a contempt of court charge, right? And there's really no opportunity to speak to the actual issue, which is the really fundamentally unfair part of the process as well.
Yeah, there's a number of layers around our justice system, criminal justice, civil justice, and it's, again, very troubling and costly. But first of all, a lot of the arrests are catch and release, which means someone is taken into a paddy wagon and then not formally arrested. They're just let go afterwards. And so I think over 250 arrests have been what is considered catch and release, where there's no fingerprinting, there's no court date, there's nothing like that. And oftentimes there's a lot of rumors of Indigenous people and people of color who have been arrested and then literally dropped off on the side of the road without their cell phones, without any recourse or ability to get where they need to go. And Catherine Chong, who's also in the documentary, speaks to this, where she was arrested, dropped off at the Port Renfrew fire station, wasn't given anything. Had no further consequences for her arrest, was just dropped off with another girl of color and peace out. But for the people who are brought into the Cowichan police services, they're given a date for the court system. And then, like you said, there's not a proper ability to just go in front of the justice. The justice says, yes, you were in violation of the injunction, or no, you weren't. If you were in violation, you can't go back to Fairy Creek and protest. If you weren't, well, you can do whatever you want. There's also a number of vehicles that have been impounded. Teal Jones has hired a private towing company to move vehicles. They're being kept on private land, and then the protesters are being charged $2,500 to get their vehicles back. This is a huge travesty. It is not there's nowhere that says Teal Jones can hire a private towing company and keep people's private belongings and then charge for them. So there's a case going on for that. And then there's a whole issue of Indigenous people who have been arrested on the front lines going to a colonial court, that their land, their livelihoods, their lives are going to be decided by probably a white male justice who is part of a colonial system and doesn't necessarily have any understanding of Indigenous history of this land. He will look at case precedent in our common law system, and most precedent is geared towards industry. And so there is a huge disconnect when Indigenous people have been denied their own culture, denied their own legal traditions, and then are forced to go into a common law system to have their cases heard by their oppressors, in effect. And so, and then the cost of these litigations, and all of this, again, could be avoided if the NDP government would just do what they said they would do when they were elected. And they can end all of this very easily with a minister's directive. Katrine Conroy, Minister of Forests, Murray Rankin, Indigenous Reconciliation, David Eby, Justice. There's so many people in government who could be doing something, but we have had gag orders. They are not speaking out publicly about anything other than we are working with Indigenous people to try to figure out what's going on. But what they say and what is actually happening are not the same. And all of this tax, again, all of this money, all of this time, all of the trauma that's being put on the protesters, all of this could be simply avoided if the government would do what they said they would do.
The idea of leaving a forest standing, I see the signs around town, it's worth more standing. And certainly, ecoforestry, and we have the example of wildwood where we can log more sustainably, and job retraining for these loggers. I mean, there's so many different ways that this could be happening, and to think that it's all going down at the same time that we're supposedly in this time of truth and reconciliation, and the exposure of the unmarked graves, like it's unbelievable, really, that this is happening still, in this time on our earth. I don't know what to say, Justin. I just really want to thank you for making the documentary. I did reach out a couple of times. My channel is for vegans, and because I do understand the connection, deep connection between industry and corporations and profiteering and media and the clearing of land to make way for animal agriculture. And so I just feel compelled to focus on vegans, and I was really glad to hear from you, and thank you for taking the time. How can people support you and find this video, and what else do you want us to know about your channel?
Yeah, it's called Canada Social Changemakers is the YouTube series. It's under Just in Canada, JUST space IN Canada, Just in Canada. You can Google it, find us on YouTube. Any, obviously, social media support is very helpful. Likes, shares, subscriptions really helps out a lot. But beyond our channel, I would really encourage anyone who wants to know more to learn more about these issues. And there's a number of places you can do this. There are some really great independent journalists on the ground. You can check out Instagram. There's the Fairy Creek Blockade page, Rainforest Flying Squad, and a number of individuals within that, and some really incredible Indigenous voices as well, who are doing their best to document and show what's going on. There are a number of fundraisers. Like I said, David and I decided, my husband and I, who created this documentary, decided that we didn't want a monetary value associated with our particular documentary. But if you are inclined to donate, there are a number of really great causes. There is Katie Jin, who is the niece of Bill Jones. You can find her on Instagram, Auntie Katie. She has a really good campaign going on so that they can continue doing Indigenous-led initiatives. There's a Kickstarter campaign for the Fairy Creek Blockade, the court money that's involved with it. So there's a lot of ways that you can donate if you are inclined to do so. But please do check out the YouTube channel, and let's all educate ourselves about what's going on.
And support the camp, absolutely. Did you get the sense that there's international awareness of what's going on?
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely individuals from across the world who are interested in what's going on, and it is the more attention that it gets locally, nationally, internationally, the more pressure it puts on politicians, on the powers that be, to acknowledge these things. So I hope so. I hope there's more. There has to be more.
Did you and David do all the editing and filming and everything yourselves?
Yeah, everything. Yeah, we were on the ground. David had this little guerrilla style camera. I did all the interviews. We edited. We did everything. Yeah.
That's a great documentary. Just in Canada on YouTube, and I'm going to go check out some of your other interviews now that I know about you. Thank you so much again, Justin, for taking the time and for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Janine. It was really a pleasure.